I'm Roger Cohen. The date is March 14th, 2006. We're at the Eagleton Institute of Politics on the Rutgers University campus in New Brunswick, and we continue our series of interviews with the staff and cabinet members of the governors of the state of New Jersey. We'll be talking to Bob Comstock, who for 2 years, 1975-1977, was the Director of Public Information in the administration of Governor Brendan Byrne. Bob, also known as a reporter and an editor for what used to be called the Bergen Record, now known as The Record. Bob, you were a 1952 graduate of what was then the Rutgers School of Journalism.
That's right.
What was your first job in journalism?
I was hired at the Ridgewood News, weekly paper in Ridgewood, New Jersey, where I lived at that time with my parents, and I got the job in the best way possible. I was working as a bookkeeper in New York City, temporary bookkeeper, and I took the bus every morning, and I saw this pretty girl get on the bus, so I began smiling and saying good morning, and then one time by chance or otherwise there was a seat next to her, and I sat down, started dating her, and her father was the managing editor. As it turned out, I got along a lot better with the old man than I did with the pretty daughter, but that got me my first job in journalism.
How long did you work for the Ridgewood News?
Oh, about a year.
And when did you then make the jump to the Record?
Yes.
What was your initial exposure to state politics, or when was your initial exposure to state politics?
Well, at the Record, the editor who hired me at the Record, Jim Sutphin, also a Rutgers alumnus, he was very big in politics. He loved politics, and it was very important, and also planning, city planning. And so my interest was raised through him. Not that I was not interested in politics at all, I was. But yes, he nurtured that.
And when was your first sojourn down to Trenton?
Well, in 1959, the Trenton correspondent, we had no bureau, the Record had no bureau in Trenton at that time, and we went down for the day, and the legislature usually met only on Mondays and not 50 Mondays a year or anything. And so we went down, and Bill Oriole was the guy who did that, and Bill Oriole wound up in the Harrison Williams campaign, and then went to Washington with Harrison Williams. So at that point, I was appointed to take over.
What was the Trenton media world like during the latter stages of the second administration of Bob Miner?
Oh, it was a lot different than it is today, I'll say that. It was tiny by comparison. There were more daily newspapers in the state, of course, then, but most of them had no one in Trenton. A lot of them did what the Record did, send a guy down whenever it seemed worthwhile to do so. And it was very informal, sitting around the table where the news conferences were held, and there was a good camaraderie kind of thing. And the governor entertained the press a couple of times, well, a Christmas party and also in the summer at Morven. And that didn't mean we didn't ask some hard questions, but it was a more congenial kind of atmosphere.
Do you remember you went down toward the end of the Miner administration. Do you remember some of the big stories that you covered? Well,
I guess the jetport in the Great Swamp that never came to be built was one of the major ones, and the fuss about that. And no, I can't reel off a...
You talk about the fact that most of the papers in the state, like the Record at that time, sent people down on the one legislative day. What about the Newark News and the Star Ledger? Did they have bureaus?
Oh, sure. They had bureaus, and the Asbury Park Press had a bureau. And the three, Vineland and I can't remember.
The Vineland Journal?
No, the three daily newspapers who were competing with each other had one correspondent who came up and wrote for all three of them. That always struck me as an unusual arrangement. And the Passaic Herald News had the legendary Bowley Schwartz, and Jersey Journal had always had someone come down.
How about the Trenton papers, or did they just...
Oh, well, they were right there, sure. Sure, they were represented. Well, I don't think the Trentonian had anyone in the State House, but it was handy.
Were you able to determine the impact that news coverage had on how the administration comported itself?
Well, sure, they reacted to, sure. And they reacted to things, but Minor, unlike others, didn't seem to be terribly upset when things leaked. He wasn't obsessed with leaks. He took them in stride, pretty much.
At that time, you also developed a relationship, I gather, with members of the legislature.
Well,
what was that like, dealing at that time with the Senate and the Assembly, and the differences between covering the governor's office and the legislature?
Well, I covered primarily the legislature, and the press walked on and sat down in any empty seat next to an assemblyman or a senator, and so on.
You could be sitting in Assemblyman Jones' seat if Assemblyman Jones wasn't there.
Oh, I guess so. I don't remember anyone doing that, but there were seats in between the senator seats. Of course, there was a smaller legislature then, so there was more room in the chambers. And I came down in '59. Walter Jones, the Bergen County senator, there was one senator from each county, and he was an active candidate for governor, really working hard at it, using statecraft to build up a reputation. And he built up a reputation. It wasn't all good, but it was very effective. He had investigations and so on. And so normally I just sat next to him when I was in the Senate chamber. Didn't worry about press galleries or anything. And it was very informal in those ways.
How long did you stay in Trenton, covering for the record?
Well, I was never a resident in Trenton.
How long were you coming down to cover?
When did I stop? Oh, it was 12 years, 13 years. I used to say, as penance for my sins, I spent 13 years covering the New Jersey legislature.
So that was through the tail end of the Minor administration, through the Hughes administration, both
Hughes.
Terms, and the Cahill administration.
Yes, and yes.
Okay. Let's talk about the differences, and as you became more acclimated to Trenton, talk about how things changed down there. Talk about the media environment itself. Television back then in New Jersey, except for Channel 13, and that's starting in 1961. Nominally, it stayed, Channel 13 was in New Jersey, but it was really a New York station. Radio, what was radio coverage of Trenton like back then?
Very little, very little. I don't remember much radio.
And TV also, the New York and Philadelphia stations?
No,
were
almost never.
So you newspaper guys basically had the whole area for yourself?
We had to take all the blame, yes.
What was it like dealing in the Hughes administration? What kind of differences were there between the governor himself and also the people with whom he worked, who you had to deal with?
Well, and Hughes was such an outgoing, genial guy, and he liked reporters, or at least most reporters, and we got along very well. And the difference between one of the main differences between Hughes and Minor, this was one of the senators, I guess, I forget who it was, but pointed out the difference, which I thought was very apt. He said, that Minor, he was, he was such a son of a gun to work with. It was just tough. It just made you work so hard to get anything from him. And Hughes, you go in to see Hughes and try and get something out of Hughes, and you walk out, you're feeling great, and you realize later he didn't give you an inch, and yet he left the office feeling great. So he really had a genius.
As the time increased, when you were coming down and doing the Trenton beat, was there more coverage around the state of what was going on in state government at that time? Were newspapers taking a greater interest in what was going on in Trenton?
Most newspapers were very local in their scheme of things, covered their area, their county, and maybe the next county, but there wasn't much statewide coverage, except out of the Newark newspapers. The Newark News was the dominant paper, of course, and a highly respected paper. And So that really dominated things.
So if these local dailies ran anything, it was probably from either the Associated Press or United Press International Wire Services, then I would imagine.
Well, I wouldn't go that far. They'd go out and do some stories, sure. But their emphasis was on their area.
Okay. It sounds like the Hughes administration was more fun to cover?
Oh, sure. Great fun.
But you also suggest that maybe you didn't get as much information out of the governor and his people as you thought you got when you left the room.
Yeah, that's always a danger, yeah.
What about the legislature itself? Any changes down there structurally which had an impact on what you were doing in terms of membership, or did that have to wait for the one man until the Constitutional Convention and the changes in the Senate and the Assembly?
Oh, well, it was very informal. The Senate president traditionally met with the press. The press went up into his office. There were few of us so we could fit into the office comfortably. And he'd serve a little May wine or a little something going on. A little in the fall, he'd always bring, what was his name? Harper. George Harper was from Sussex County. And he brought down some Sussex County cider, and very informal, and the repartee back and forth and joshing back and forth. And no one ever said this is off the record or anything like that, but it was just understood that there was a sort of an unwritten code.
That certain things weren't written about.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
When did that change?
Well, of course, Watergate had was the major factor, I think, and the Vietnam controversy, which overlapped, changed the whole thing around. The feeling and the relationship between the press corps. At Watergate really had, Brendan Byrne was really a creature of Watergate. I mean, he won by the biggest percentage in the history of the state when he first elected in '73, and that was largely because the reaction to Watergate. I'm not saying he wouldn't have won anyway, but he certainly won bigger than he would have. So in that way, he was a child of Watergate, but he also inherited a press corps which was impressed with what had happened with Woodward and Bernstein and so on, bringing down a president, and went into what I dubbed at the time fly-spec journalism, where every reporter was waiting to see the mayor drop gravy on his tie or something, or slip and so on, and make a big story out of that. A lot of emphasis for somewhat less important facts of life. Something that affected me when I was in the Byrne administration. When Brendan Byrne was in the Minor administration, and Minor, the bachelor governor, married and brought his bride to Morven, and they bought a dog, as everyone should have a dog, I guess, and they notified the press, and the press came out, and they took pictures of the governor throwing the ball with the dog and all this, and Brendan saw that, and he remembered that fondly. So then, the Byrne dog died, and after some little contretemps about getting along with cats, but Jean Byrne, she was not a cat person, and she insisted on another. So they got a dog, and the governor told me, tell the press. He had this vision in his mind of what happened to Minor. Let them know that, they can come, and I'm going to be there and a certain time and place. Well, how many photographers do you suppose showed up to take a picture of the governor playing ball with his dog? None. Did any reporter take any notice? Oh, yes, the Ledger take notice. They went to the Borough Hall to see if the dog had a license. Fortunately, you don't need a license in Princeton until you're 6 months old, and he was still a puppy, so we got through that crisis.
You talked about the Ledger, the only paper that took note. I would have thought that the Newark News would have taken note, except the Newark News went out of business.
Was dead. Yeah.
What kind of impact did that have on the quality of coverage in the state? The demise of that paper.
Oh, it was missed greatly. I think it was greatly missed. hard put to compete against their much larger staff much larger staff generally, and particularly in the work that I covered. And so in some ways it maybe made my life a little easier, but no, it was greatly missed. We've all depended upon the Newark News and its many editions and the way it covered the state. It left the Ledger, of course, as the dominant paper in the state, and the Ledger adjusted to that and began doing much more than it had done before. But no, the Newark News was sorely to be missed, and it was such a shame that it went out the way it did. It just a labor management dispute, and both sides were stupid. Or short-sighted. Let me amend that. Short-sighted.
How long did it take the Ledger? You said it eventually started to assume much of what the Newark News had been doing. How long did it take the Ledger to adjust to that?
Oh, not very long. I don't know how long, but not very long. And they did it by putting in 3 reporters. 3? Was it 3 or 4? That had great flexibility, and they developed big stories, most of which ran on Sundays, and then they also had columns where and the combination of going crusading as columnists and also covering things as supposedly objective reporters. There was a much larger expectation of what passed for objectivity back in those days that's gone out the window now to a large degree.
Did the Ledger make use of the folks from the Newark News, from the reporters and editors?
They hired some. I don't recall. Not a great many.
You're citing you cited Watergate as a time when you felt that journalism began to change, but you also said the Vietnam War, and you said they overlap. The Vietnam War goes back to 1965 when President Johnson, I guess, made the major troop commitment. Were you referring to the fact that journalism even began to change back then?
Yeah, not that early, but in the late 60s, sure. Certainly in 68, when there was such a major thing and people out in the streets and so on. I covered
Kent State.
Kent State. I didn't cover Kent State, but I was at the Chicago Convention in 68 and got tear gassed. And you know, this kind of thing, and the way that the press was lied to, the light at the end of the tunnel and so on, and all those things that McNamara is now doing penance for. Sure, disinformation, that certainly had a major effect.
You talk about how journalism had changed during that time. What about politics changing? Dealing with legislators, dealing with the governors. Did things change differently how politicians dealt with the press and with the people? That's
an interesting question. Not that your other questions have been boring.
That's okay, Bob.
I don't think the average politician changed as much as the press corps did. I think the change was more marked in the reporters' and editors' attitude toward government. The average politician, the average state senator or assemblyman and so on, or mayor, I don't think they changed as much. They sized up the reporters covering them, and they figured which ones were the good guys and which ones weren't, and which ones they could trust and so on. And most of them have a tendency for backslapping and that kind of stuff. I don't think they changed all that much.
So, but the congenial atmosphere sounds like it might have become more selective.
Yes, absolutely.
You mentioned before that you first met Brendan Byrne when he was on Governor Minor's staff back in the 50s. What was your initial impression of this young man?
Oh, he came with a reputation. No, he was just a very congenial guy and very competitive. They played basketball in the pool, you know, to the degree you can do that. But anyhow, yeah, he was very competitive and very likable.
Did you have any contact in the interim between the time that you knew him from Minor's staff to his first term when he first ran for governor?
Well, sure, I'd see him occasionally at political dinners that I covered.
Well, he was what, an ex-county prosecutor. He was a judge.
A judge, so he didn't come to political dinners then, no. But I'd seen him around. No, I didn't have much contact with him. We didn't know each other well.
Well, you were with the Record, and by 1972, did the Record have a bureau down in Trenton?
Oh, yes.
When did that happen?
What year did that happen? Maybe 62 or 63.
Okay, so you were there for...
I wasn't there. Jim Ahern was our Trenton correspondent, and he was in
and he was a one-man band basically down there?
Yes, except I still went down on
legislative days.
And then later we had others come down with us in legislative
When did the bureau start to grow, the on-site bureau?
About more than one man?
Yeah.
I don't know what year that was. I guess it was probably in the 70s.
Well, what were you doing in 1972? For the Record.
72?
On the Record, for the Record.
They made me an editorial writer, which was not my goal.
You did this under protest?
No, I'm a good soldier. I took it on and learned to do it, but it took me a while to get comfortable with it. And so I was writing editorials and a weekly column.
And a weekly political column. And you did that from 1972 until 1975.
Yes.
Okay. Which is when you were approached by the Byrne administration. What had, up to that point, what had you thought about the deeds of the Byrne administration, pro and con?
Well, it hadn't been very many deeds. I thought he got off to a very strong start. I mean, if I can remember which things happened when, but they got postcard registration and sunshine law. Again, an effective Watergate. Got through a sunshine law in New Jersey.
Well, he ran on this, what, was it government under glass?
That's right. And I thought he got off to a very good start.
And you're making it sound like that didn't last all that long.
Well, we developed some difficulties.
How did you treat him as a columnist? How did you treat him? As an editorial writer, you were representing the views of the paper, but as a political columnist, those were your own views. Were there differences between the two pages in terms of how it treated the governor and what the governor was doing?
Yeah, but my political column was not dealing with it was mainly about politics in the narrow sense, partisan politics, and that kind of thing. And I wasn't denouncing.
You weren't dissecting policy, in other words.
No. No, that was I wrote editorials doing that, but as you say, they were anonymous.
Who approached you about joining the Byrne administration, and when?
Well,
Deep Throat?
Herb Wolf approached me.
Herb Wolf, at that being
had the job, director of public information, but signals were sent out there. At that time, I was unhappy at the Record. Things going on there that I found to be mistakes, and I was restive, and I talked to the big boss and arranged to get that I could get a what do you call it? Leave of absence. Because the Record had, for years, had been calling for an income tax. It had been pounding it and during the Cahill administration, the Record allowed Leon Zimmerman to go down to join the Cahill administration to try and help with that. He never came back. That doesn't as ominous as it sounds. But he did not return to Hackensack. And so through my friends in the press, I got the word to Herb Wolf that I might be willing to talk about that.
It's interesting, with mentioning Leon Zimmerman, it almost sounds as if the Record enabled various administrations to try to improve the chances of getting an income tax through.
We tried to do that with our editorials as well, yes.
When did you said you had seen when he wasn't governor, Brendan Byrne. What was your initial contact with the governor when you were initially offered the job? He was not a stranger to you, but did you have the job before you met him, or did you have to pass muster with the boss?
Oh, no, I had an interview with him, but the initial interview was with Dick Leone, whom I knew well, and with Jerry English, whom I didn't know at all. And in the Newark office, the governor has an office in Newark, Spartan, but so I went down and had an interview with them, and then it followed up. I went down and
What was the interview with Brendan Byrne like?
Informal, informal, and asked me some things. I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was very friendly.
Well, Trenton had been used, and governors had been used to having former reporters
Oh, sure.
assume these positions. But beg the question of you jumping the fence, so to speak. You going to what some people might consider the other side.
Oh.
You were a journalist. Now you're working for the administration. What was it like to do that?
Well, it was a big adjustment, but it was not all that unusual, you know. I mean, that turnstile journalist is the term that's used. It's not a compliment for those of us who do that. And I mean, Bill Moyers, where did he start out? He started out as a preacher, but after that, he started out with Lyndon Johnson. What's his name on Meet the Press?
Worked for Rockefeller, right?
Huh? Yeah, he worked for
Cuomo.
He worked for Cuomo, and he worked for Moynihan.
That's right.
And then he moved on into journalism.
I can't believe I can't think of his name. What was it?
Russert.
Yeah, Ted Russert. That's right, Ted Russert. So it's a tradition.
And
this is not unusual.
Look at John Farmer, not the former AG, but the distinguished columnist. He had the job which I had for the last 10 months of the Byrne administration. He came in and finished up.
Why was it frowned upon if it was done regularly, if we can use that word, and people made the jump back as you did, which we'll talk about in a while, and John Farmer did and others did? Why was it frowned upon as doing turnstile journalism? It was just another job, so to speak.
Well, there are dangers. I mean, you couldn't go back and cover. You couldn't go back and then cover the administration of which you'd been a part. There's no law against it, but I mean,
ethically,
unethical. Yeah, I would never do that. But I did go back and become top editor on the newspaper, which had a Trenton bureau, and I very consciously avoided influencing in a partisan way.
What kind of organization on the information side did Herb Wolf hand off to you? How many staffers did you have? How were they assigned? Because you had mentioned before to me that there was pretty large-scale reorganization of the office.
Oh, sure.
In response to what?
In response to poverty. That trying to pass an income tax, and they were cutting government right and left, cutting government all over, cutting the costs and so on. And this was an effort made. What did I inherit? There was a press secretary, Dick Campbell, and assistant press secretary, Kathy Forsyth, who handled mostly broadcast media. You asked about, well, that's different. And then there were two other young women in there who handled different elements, plus clerical support. That's all in the governor's office. But when we were cutting costs in the summer of '75, we decided to the governor challenged me to come up with a plan, and I came up with a plan. I understand that Cahill administration tried to do the same thing, but gave up on it. But we set up what was called the Central Office of Public Communications, widely known as the Press Pool. And we got a room upstairs in the State House, and we reduced the number of public information officers from 43 to 22, and we were only able to cut out one photographer from 5 to 4, and clericals were cut from 20 to 14. And that was claimed to be a saving of $250,000 a year. That was a lot of money back in those days, we thought it was. And so I put this through, and chortles, and said it couldn't work, and of course it was most unpopular with whom?
The people who weren't working there anymore.
Oh, well, those. But the cabinet officers, you're going to strip a cabinet
They used to have
officer
their own
of
PIOs.
his or her own public information staff. They were out. Of course, we weren't foolish enough to try to take the Attorney General's spokesman away, or certain other ones. But
any stories from that? I mean, did certain cabinet officers react in certain ways that are memorable?
oh, sure.
Go ahead.
But
Don't be
they
afraid
were
to tell
very.
us.
The labor and industry got a lot of its money from the federal government, federal aid, which is fed through there, and they made the argument, which we bought, that these PIOs were paid out of federal funds. How could we grab people being paid with federal funds and move them around? So we left them alone. And the Attorney General, the state police, the specialized kind of stuff, and the PUC is in Newark. You could hardly have someone speaking for the PUC down in Trenton when everything is happening up in Newark. So we used common sense in that regard. Still, we made that cut. And and also agriculture. No one was going to take Phil Lampe's spokesperson away from him. He was too long and deeply entrenched. No one fooled around with Phil. So, but we cut those out, and of course, you know what happened after the tax passed. What do you know? Gradually, every cabinet officer had his own PIOs, which is probably not a terrible thing.
Were there, you mentioned Phil Lampe and some of the others like John, were there any cabinet officers with whom you had more contact than others? That your work from the governor's office required you to touch base with them more frequently, perhaps?
Well, Dick Leone, sure. Dick Leone was more than that. He was a key member of the administration, involved in all sorts of things. And he always had a soft spot for the press, got along beautifully with...
Do you know why? Yes,
Just a genetic...
you were just grateful that he did.
A genetic flaw, I guess. I don't know.
Tell us about the publicity. You're an advertising guy, a PR guy, obviously, for government, trying to push the income tax. When did that start to build momentum?
Did it? I'm not sure it did. Oh, it was a dreadful period. The tax came up in one form or another and got shot down. And even though the governor had been elected not only by a huge plurality, but also sweeping in big majorities in both houses of the legislature of his own party, and he couldn't get it passed, especially in the Senate. He finally got it passed in the Assembly a couple of times, and then the Senate wouldn't go for it. So it was not happy times, not happy times.
What do you think got it through?
What got it through?
Yeah.
I don't think there's any argument on that point. What got it through was stubbornness. Brendan Byrne, with all his good qualities, is a very stubborn man, and he believed when he believes in things, he sticks with them, and he stuck with it, and finally turned it over to the Senate, really, because that's where the big problem was. Assembly having voted for it twice, and the senators improved it, made it different anyway, and made it more politically palatable, and put in the homestead rebates and so on. But what finally passed it was the Supreme Court closed down the schools on July 1st, 1976. New Jersey celebrated its bicentennial by closing summer schools, by closing public school operations entirely. And so, you know, critics say, well, the Supreme Court did it, not the governor. But it was Governor Byrne himself who went before the Supreme Court, representing the state, and made the arguments to lead the Supreme Court to that decision.
And the governor took a lot of flack on that?
Flack?
Initially? Heavy flack?
For the tax, not for going before the Supreme Court.
No, on the tax. So
for the tax.
and how did your office handle it?
One-term burn. You've heard of you remember the bumper stickers, right? Yeah, sure. And big revolts in his own party, and finally into a very public and nasty feud with the Democratic state chairman, Jim Dugan, who was also a state senator. Yeah, it was not a happy time.
Going back to the arm twisting you suggested took place with the governor and the legislature, were you privy to any meetings between the governor and the legislative leadership in which he tried to force them to go his way, bend his way?
Well, now, I differentiate. I mean, I certainly wasn't privy to any private discussions between the governor and legislators, no. But occasionally he'd have the leadership in, and I sometimes sat in the room when that was going on, and they'd talk about it. And, you know, he'd slouch back in his chair in his casual way, and the discussion would ramble around here, and this senator would get up and so on. And part of me felt, Governor, could you please take charge of this meeting? But that was not his manner. That was not his way. And look, he got it, and he got reelected.
How did it finally come around to doing what you felt needed to be done in terms of getting accomplished what needed to be accomplished?
Well,
I gather he was able to make certain points during these very laid-back sessions?
Oh, sure, he can make his points fine, yeah.
How about threats?
Threats.
No threats?
Not that I know of, no.
I'm just talking in terms of power of the governor. Governor of New Jersey, with strongest
Pretty
governor.
powerful governor, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you know whether he was able to wield that power on this issue?
Yes, but I've read that his critics felt he couldn't tell what he was going to do. In other words, sometimes he approved a job as a reward for somebody, but you couldn't count on it. You couldn't count on him. And he certainly wouldn't approve a job for anyone he didn't approve of. I mean, he had high standards for the people that got appointed at the levels that the governor was directly involved. And so they thought that he was something of a riddle to the traditional politicians, which is a real irony, because his father was in politics, and he was raised in a political household, and I understand that frequently on the weekends the house was crowded with Irish politicians backslapping and doing whatever they do in their off hours and so on, but very little of this seems to have rubbed off on Brendan.
Compare him, if you will, based on what you just said, with the demeanor and the behavior of Bob Miner, Dick Hughes, and Bill Cahill, people who you were involved, at least in covering. You weren't in the inner circle, as it were, but you certainly saw how they did what they did.
Yeah, well, Hughes and Cahill were both Irish politicians, right? And they were, I don't mean to suggest that it's all a stereotype or it's all a matter of eugenics, but they enjoyed a party. They enjoyed staying up, and Cahill would even offer an occasional song late in the evening, and and they enjoyed that kind of relationship. Brendan, well, he hated to get trapped at a head table and avoided it much as he could. His usual thing was to be introduced over the fruit cup and make his little statement and shake a few hands on the way out and go home and watch a game on television.
He evolved. He evolved, and I mean, what a wonderful raconteur. How and when did he develop that reputation?
Oh, he always could tell. He always had a great sense of humor. Not everybody's cup of tea, but an ironic sense of humor, and usually self-effacing. And
he always seemed to hold his own at the legislative correspondence.
Oh, he became the star. He became the star when who was I've forgotten his name, former Attorney General. That was so so good at that and did it for decades from the Driscoll administration. But, you know, and he became the star, and governors came and governors went, and they all got up and tried to be funny, and some of them succeeded and others had less success. But Brendan became the thing they saved for last because he could always bring down the house.
Did you ever do anything in your job as the Director of Public Information that you regretted having to do? Something that as a journalist rubbed you the wrong way and that you just felt uncomfortable with?
No, not in the sense that twice I told untruths. I didn't know they were untrue, but twice I told the press corps something which turned out to be untrue, and which one reporter had gotten the leak from elsewhere that hadn't reached me, so I certainly regret that. That was inadvertent.
Well, inadvertent. What was your response to that? Did you go to certain people and say, why wasn't I informed of the proper information?
Yes, but I'm not sure I got any answer.
But obviously it didn't happen. It happened too frequently.
No, twice.
You said you had wanted to talk about some of the things in terms of the Byrne administration accomplishments while you were there that most people would not think of, and you mentioned one of them already, which was the Sunshine Law. Well, you said I gathered you wanted to talk about some other things.
Yeah, well, most people say, what were the major accomplishments of the Byrne administration? The income tax, whether they're fans or dreaded enemies of it, the Meadowlands Sports Complex, gambling in Atlantic City, which, by the way, was the only thing I recall where I differed with the Byrne administration. I thought that was a mistake, and still do. But nevertheless, it's there. And so on. But
and the Pinelands, I guess.
The Pine Barrens, which is certainly a major accomplishment. 350,000 acres preserved with the aquifer underneath them. How much we need that now, yeah. And that was a tough fight to get through. But in addition to those, you talked about television. Television, you know, Byrne was really upset that the television in New York and Philadelphia paid so little attention to New Jersey, to New Jersey state affairs. You'd think that the guy who got so much bad press and so much bad time on the air wouldn't want any more, maybe. But he did, and first of all, he tried to get the FCC to give us back a VHF channel in New Jersey. 13. Yeah, well, that one or some other one.
I guess Channel 9 possibly.
Take it away from public television. But get one assigned here, and then that didn't work. So then he wanted to get them to require the New York and Philadelphia stations to have one camera crew dedicated to New Jersey, and that didn't work. But then he put it through the so-called shotgun marriage between Channel 13 and what is now New Jersey Network. It was Brendan's shotgun that put that through. I had the honor of holding the shotgun. I sat in on all those discussions with John J. Island from Channel 13 and Larry Freimeyer from New Jersey.
Were those contentious meetings?
They were not friendly meetings. I mean, no threats were made, but both sides were very reluctant to do this. Well,
first, let's take Channel 13. Let's take New Jersey, at that time I guess called Jersey Vision.
Yeah.
Let's take Larry Freimeyer's side. He was the first executive director of what we'll call New Jersey Public Television. Why was he against it?
Because he was Dr. Freimeyer. He was an educator. This was educational television, or had been, and he was interested in having that kind of programming. He knew he had to run a few cartoons, but you could make an argument that was educational. But he didn't want a nightly newscast, a discussion. He would happy to have public officials come in and be interviewed, but he didn't want to have camera crews out there covering things.
Well, Bob, let me just go back. I'm trying to remember. They had a nightly newscast during certainly when they went on the air during the Cahill administration.
Yes, a little bit, yes.
Hold on. Bob, as we were saying, talking about NGN, it did have a news operation, really, I think, almost from day one when it went on the air, but not the kind of operation that I gather the governor wanted.
No, and he used to, it was all on UHF, which was not, cable was not anywhere near as big. Now we can, almost everyone has cable. And he used to say, well, as good as that, he said, you have to sandpaper your fingers to get the, you know, to get anything. And so that he wanted to have a real news show, and here was a chance to get Channel 13 to live up to its obligation, which was to have an hour of New Jersey-oriented programming, whatever that term means, on every day. And so he went in there and got John J. Islin was the new manager or president of Channel 13, and we talked about it. Freimeyer, I think, wasn't particularly interested in news, and he saw getting in with the big giant from New York. He didn't want to lose control over what he had, naturally. No one likes to give that up. So anyhow, we finally got them to do it, and they brought in other people. Some guy from Oklahoma, I don't remember his name, but he didn't like it in New Jersey. He went back to Oklahoma and then wrote an op-ed piece on why. But anyhow.
But you said Islin also didn't want it. Well, this would have given him an opportunity to
what?
To have some programming that would answer the question about whether or not Channel 13, licensed to Newark, was doing anything for New Jersey.
Well, they had some programming, but it has grown so much more since. They have all different programs on now. And it's grown out of that, but it grew out of that shotgun marriage there where they coerced them into working together, and they did. And certainly it's become a more professional news operation, and it's available. You don't have to, I mean, anyone can watch it on Channel 13. You don't have to have cable or UHF. And I guess that's enlarged its audience, being on 530.
Let's go back a little bit. When we're talking about you were a member of the press before you joined the Byrne administration. Talk about what it was like. Well, you were back, I guess, back in Hackensack with the Record. Did you ever come down for any press conferences with the governor?
Yeah, sometimes.
Talk about what you saw. How did the governor comport himself for press conferences when you were a reporter, and were you able to perhaps improve his performance or improve his approach to press conferences when you took the job?
Yes, we had a striking, brilliant scheme there. He would conduct press conferences as he conducted interviews with senators or anyone else, slouched back in his office chair, very casual, and in his usual, you know, the way he speaks, which many people compared to a dial tone. His own word for it was a blocked punt. But you write me a speech, but it comes across as a block punt. Everything was an athletic image. And so we got together, and it was a tough sell, but we finally got him to say, get out of your chair, Governor. Here's a rostrum with the seal on it. Stand up. And of course, like everything else, the press took this as a reason for criticism. What's this for? He wants to be looking down on us. He must be standing and looking down, and so on, and so on. And it did. I believe that it didn't change the course of events, but it didn't make a dramatic difference. But it did. Yeah, it was more. What
about substance? Did you prepare talking points for him, and how did he respond to your efforts?
He didn't want. Yes, if he felt it was going to be tough on a particular point, why, you'd give him a paragraph or two. He didn't want to.
Even on the income tax? He still wanted to be.
I didn't have to tell him anything about the income tax. He knew much more about it than I did.
But weren't you concerned about him he spoke his mind, had a reputation.
Right.
Were you concerned that he might misspeak at a point?
I don't recall that, no. So, misspeak, the major misspeak thing, which really came to haunt him and was a major factor, was on the boardwalk in Asbury Park in the summer of '73, when someone asked him, a reporter asked him almost casually about the income tax. He said, "I don't think we'll need it for the foreseeable future." Well, the foreseeable future, I mean, he knew perfectly well that was a misspeak, because the Supreme Court had ruled earlier that spring about having to change the arrangement.
Well, it was an informed misspeak, shall we say. He basically knew what he was saying, it just simply wasn't
I don't know,
true.
I wasn't there. But any case, that came back to haunt him, and he concedes that was a major gaffe to have said that. He does that now. I mean, he did that soon after. Where were we?
I think you may have exhausted about it, but working with him, he was pretty much his own. He pretty much could speak.
We come in before the news conference.
Oh, on talking points, okay.
And instead of a formal talking points, we just say, well, this is certainly going to come up, and I know that that's concerned, and it might be helpful. A little thing like that, but these were very brief, very brief. He's a very quick study.
Right. Now, you were in control of the press conferences, I gather. Or he was through. In terms of length, you could step in and decide that this is the last question.
Oh no, I didn't do that. No.
You let the governor.
Yeah, he did it.
So he really was not. You did not feel any need, or were not asked to control any aspect of that. Did that frustrate you, or would you have liked to have had a little more control? Would you feel it would have been more helpful if you had some way to rein him in, or were you happy letting him be himself?
Probably neither. No, I wasn't happy the way things were going, because obviously we were under big attack. But no, I didn't feel to range him in. I'm not ranging in the governor. That wasn't his style anyway. He'd get up and saunter out when it was through. There was a tradition that the senior reporter got to thank him. That's right. The tradition was the senior reporter would thank him. "Thank you, Governor." And for years, that was before, when I was a reporter. It was John Davies for years from the...
With the Camden Courier, I think, right?
Well, originally from the Newark News.
Oh.
And then the Gannett papers. But no, they asked that, but he would let them know.
You left the Byrne administration before the re-election took place, but you certainly worked with him and his staff as he was preparing to run for re-election. When did the talk formally begin about the second term?
Well, in the summer of '75.
So 2 years before the election.
Yes. Early, I think it was June, early in the summer anyway.
And before the income tax was passed.
Oh, yeah, when we were being berated on it. A group got together, of which I was a member, and had discussions and drew up a paper, which they delivered to him, outlining a whole bunch of things that he might do. All kinds of things, from issuing policy papers and
Who was the leader of this group, if you can remember?
I don't know. I had an elected leader, but I think that Attorney General Highland was certainly a major factor in there, and John Spinelli, who was an advisor to the governor, was an important factor, and I'm probably leaving out a couple of other major factors. But yeah, and it went right down to window dressing things, like inviting city kids to come and swim at Morven. Yeah, everyone would think that was a genuine gesture, right? Out of the goodness of your heart. No one would think that was a political move. Anyway, a whole bunch of things like that. So that they were talking about that, and then later in the fall, the group met not the whole group, a smaller group got together, and we offered some suggestions. But there was concern. Sure, there was concern. Had to be.
What was the timeline when you talk about coming up with ideas? You had first of all, the income tax to worry about because it hadn't been implemented by that first meeting. And secondly, you had still a 2-year run before he was up for re-election, or maybe a year and a half before he would start to actively campaign. So what was the timeline in terms of doing all these things to lead up to the re-election campaign? Did you have an idea or really a plot about how you wanted things to happen?
I was not privy to any grand scheme. No,
you were not in the inner circle.
They passed the income tax, and the homestead rebates were going to go out. There was a question of whether the governor could sign the checks, and no, that was unconstitutional. The state treasurer had to sign the checks. So, okay, but that didn't stop him from putting his name on the envelope. So you got the envelope from the governor's office, and those kinds of things. But no, there was no grand scheme. I want to go back to television. You talked about television.
Yes.
And his frustration at not getting Jersey stuff on television. One of the things that we had was an economic development authority, which brought jobs. Someone estimated them at 177,000 jobs that year. I wouldn't vouch for the number, but anyhow, it brought jobs to New Jersey, and it didn't cost anything except a little clerical work and stationery because people served on the council without compensation. And this was having a real effect, and he couldn't get any press, certainly no television wherever he paid attention. And that was a frustration. And one day I'm looking over the economic, and I see, oh, there was some money was given to a matzah bakery in Jersey City, a matzah bakery, and that's just across the river from New York. And the idea of this Irish governor, so we got him up there. We put on a baker's hat and got him out there. It was a mechanized. The matzah came out on a track, and he's there with a spatula. I don't know much about baking matzahs, but I don't think you need a spatula. But he had one anyway, and we got 3 camera crews, and got him on. And of course, then he could talk a little bit about the effectiveness of the program. Wow, that was I consider that a great triumph. And I immediately started looking for some money we'd given to a cheesesteak place down in Camden or Gloucester, but I never found one.
You said it was a real triumph. Did you have trouble convincing the assignment editors and the producers that this was something worthy of their attention?
Just put out the press advisory, and they jumped at it. It's the showboat kind of thing, or I don't know, what is it? You're a broadcast man.
I guess it also depends what's on the schedule.
And we also, another one was when the tax passed. Of course, the tax wasn't one bill; it was a whole package of bills. And one of them, for the homestead rebate, the most popular part, I guess, we got him to sign that at a private home in Belleville, which is also fairly close, and billed it as the first time in the history of the state that a governor has signed a bill into law in a private home. And they bought that too.
Could you prove that? It sounded legit.
I went to the library, the state library.
It's funny, just going back just a little bit, I can remember in the 70s, we had talked earlier about radio's presence in Trenton, which for many, many years was negligible. But I certainly can remember there's a gentleman whom I'm blocking on now, Gene Dillard.
Oh, Gene Dillard's still there, isn't he?
Yeah, I believe so. From WFIL, there was the AP audio. In other words, radio stations, if they weren't sending their own people down, they seemed to be being served by either their own reporter or a service. So at least state information was getting out. They came in.
There was no radio presence in the State House.
Except for Dillard.
And he's now still there, but he sells his stuff to anyone who buys. He's a freelancer now. And he doesn't say who's affiliated with. It's Gene Dillard in Trenton. But, oh yeah, he's a real pro, and he's got longevity. But also, Kathy Forsyth that I mentioned, she'd go around with a tape recorder and get the governor to comment, or not just the governor, cabinet officers, whoever was newsworthy, to comment and put that available so they could call in.
The governor had a news line, I can remember.
Yeah, right. And so you could, on your local station, you could have it sound as if you'd interviewed the governor or you'd interviewed the chancellor or whoever was making news that day.
Do you remember by the time you left, and again you were there only through not even the end of 77, about the progress that was, besides the story that you're talking about, the matzah story. Was the governor, by the end, at that time, more pleased with what television was doing, or he still felt that it was negligible? That it was just kind of hit and miss, and there was so much more the stations could do?
If he was more pleased, he never confided that to me. No.
But was his frustration evident?
Yeah, well, his frustration was evident, and he joked, he passed it off with a joke. For instance, one of his famous lines was, I look out this window at the Delaware River, and I figured if I walked across the water, the headlines the next day would say, "Byrne can't swim." And that was frustrating. He made a lot of those past. I guess it helped a little bit.
Okay. Let's go back to what we were talking about, the second Byrne campaign that you were involved with initially. Post income tax passage. That fall, you said there was a meeting, got together and talked about some things. What was your sense of the governor's chance at that time? I mean, this was kind of would you call it the nadir of his tenure?
No, I think it was worse before the tax passed. Once the tax passed, people gradually learning about it, more about it, and.
Wait, we're talking early on. We're talking about the tax passed when? Right?
In summer of '76.
In June, right before?
July.
I'm sorry, it was a special session.
Absolutely, very special. The schools were closed.
So we're only talking about a 3 or a 4 month difference. Was that enough time to really have the people of New Jersey feel good? Of course, the first
feel good. A lot of them still don't feel good.
The homestead rebate check, the first homestead rebate check came
in October.
So
yes.
That did something to
that helped
mollify.
A bit. That helped a lot. Yeah. But Brendan Byrne, I believe, always felt that eventually they'd learn about the various aspects of it and why it was necessary and important and the right thing to do. He would have appreciated more help from the news media, broadcast and print, in bringing that about. But he was confident that would happen.
What were you said the record was supportive of the income tax. What about the rest of the print media in the state? How did the Ledger stand? How did the Passaic Herald, the Trenton papers? Do you remember what editorial positions they took?
I don't remember them all. I mean, the Ledger, no, I'm going back too far now. The Ledger was very far right back when the Newark News was still in publishing, but that they changed. Mort Pye changed that around. But no, they weren't, few of them were campaigning actively against it, but I didn't do an assessment.
Did you think in that fall of 1975, did you think he would or should run again?
Sure, I thought he should run again, because he'd done a lot of good things and was trying to do others, and had been good for New Jersey. And I thought he should run. I wasn't going to bet the farm on success, but boy, how it worked out. Wow.
When and why did you leave state government?
I left because the Record called me back and offered me the job as the executive editor.
They made you an offer you couldn't refuse.
That's right. Vice president and executive editor.
And no second thoughts about that? You just jumped at it? Or did you have any regrets about leaving?
No, I don't regret about leaving. I was always more comfortable. We'll come back to comfortable. I was always more comfortable on the press side than in government. I wish I'd had an opportunity to be in government earlier in my career, on the other side of that locked door, to see how decisions are made, or too often make themselves, and how a state senator's ego or somebody's turn of events here or there influences things. If I had had that experience and then gone back to the press, I would have written even more brilliant columns and editorials.
When you left, you didn't say when you left. When in 1977?
In March.
Okay, so it's about 6 months, 7 months, 8 months, almost 8 months before the election.
I got the offer to go back to the Record at Christmas time.
Nice present.
And I said, yeah. And I said, well, I can't leave now. And they accepted that, and I stayed through the annual message and the budget message, which I wrote, and got him through that.
You talk about you wish you had gotten in the state government earlier, in other words, really be exposed to it earlier. When you went back and you were the boss, not the publisher, but a step below the publisher, Malcolm Borg, did your 2 years' experience have any effect on the way the Record covered Trenton? In other words, certain things that you learned, were you able to pass on to the folks who were then covering the State House, the legislature, and the governor?
Some, yes. But it was a two-edged sword, because I was, a lot of the staff, a lot of the editorial staff at the Record thought it was terrible that I was coming back, and that I'd turn the Record into just anything Brendan Burns said, just a cheering section, which didn't happen. I stayed out of the editorial decisions, and
how long did it take? Was there a small group, or was there kind of a general discontent around that they didn't know whether they could trust you anymore?
We didn't take a show of hands, Roger, but it was a lot of them were quite resentful and didn't like it at all, and went on to other jobs. Yeah, left.
They actually left because you had returned.
They were obviously unhappy with me.
Anything you were looking back now, or even back then when you left, when you took the Record, the offer from the Record, 2 years, again, not all that long a time, but anything you regret not doing, decisions that you did or didn't make that were, you would have thought about differently?
In state government?
In state government.
No, I don't think of any offhand. I certainly, if I'd known as much about the operation of state government in 75 as I knew in 77, I would have been more effective, sure. Yeah. But I can't think of, no.
Did you ever kill a story while you were working for the governor, a story that somebody wanted to get out, but you thought, while the press might love it, you thought would be, bring an adverse reaction against the governor?
Did I kill a story?
Did you kill an idea, something that the information, maybe not a story yet, but information that could have led to a story, that you decided this is not a good idea, we shouldn't let this information out?
No. No. I advised him on how to do things, and sometimes instead of putting out a press release for publication, we put out press advisories just so they'd understand something going on. But no. He was very open to that. He was very open to my advice on that kind of thing. But no, I didn't kill any stories.
It's funny, you talk about when the governor's sense of, we're talking about the income tax, about people will eventually come around. He was a positive thinker. He was not it didn't sound like he was a cynic in any way, shape, or form.
No, I don't think he's a cynic. No. And he thought he was right, and therefore it was. What else?
This is, I say, he was right, and therefore he just.
And then, it turned out right. Now he's regarded as a very good governor. You were always confident that history would realize that he was right and would right the things and so on. And he had this. It was tough while it was going on. Remember that Gene Byrne once got so upset by things. Oh, it was when they opened the racetrack at the Meadowlands. Here's this guy where sports, and he always regards himself as an athlete. Speaks of being an athlete, and that it's important to him, and it's important to get away for that racquetball game on Wednesday afternoons. Not every Wednesday, but frequently, because relaxing, I can do a better job. He believes that, and I guess it's true. Anyhow, they went to the opening of the racetrack, and as he would introduce, the crowd booed him. Here they got this big racetrack with the stadium under construction next door, and everything, and the sports fans booed him. Well, of course, that was the headline everywhere and on the evening news. But Jean Byrne was moved to write, and she wrote a letter to newspapers defending, letter to the editor defending her husband. I have a copy of it. And and he then, the Trenton Times ran a highly critical editorial saying he shouldn't run again, and the Record picked it up and ran it on its op-ed page, others' opinions. And he wrote to both papers and set things straight. And speaking of papers, the press coverage, another thing we did was it wasn't just television that he missed, it was the printed press. And the New York Times was really giving him a very rough time, and I wrote.
Was this Ron Sullivan? Was he still the
Yep.
State House reporter?
And I wrote, and I got us invited to lunch with the editorial board of the Times. John B. Oakes and Sulzberger, Punch Sulzberger was there, and so on. And they do things nicely at the Times, lovely dining room and everything. We sat around, and Byrne, while he was not very effective on making a speech to the legislature, in a small group, he was very effective, and he talked with them. And finally, after he's discussing these things, and he obviously on top of the issues that they're asking about, Sulzberger asked him, "Governor, why do you get such a bad press?" And he responded, "Funny, I was going to ask you that very question." And 3 weeks later, there was a new reporter covering Trenton for the Times.
Don had mentioned some other stories, one specifically at the National Governors Conference. Can you tell us that story, and maybe kind of some other anecdotal things that basically point to the kind of guy he is?
Well, yes, we went to the National Governors Conference, I believe it was in New Orleans, and the hotel where we stayed had a rooftop pool, and he went up to get his exercise, to swim in the pool and so on, and he was wearing a Mark Spitz type, very skimpy briefs and so on, and he lay down on a chaise lounge, and a photographer came and took a picture of him. And right away, they realized that this probably wasn't the kind of image of the governor attending a national conference that you want sent back. But I guess it must have been a wire service reporter, because the picture moved and ran in all the Jersey papers. And he came down, and that was one of the few times he came, sought me out, and told me what happened. Said, delivering bad news. That he
Upset?
Huh?
Upset?
Oh, yeah.
Terribly upset?
No. But he knew that was wrong, and he knew it was going to cause us problems, and I was, in charge of public information, and here's something.
So he actually gave you a heads up?
Oh, yeah.
On this?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Today's politicians, and even going back a little while, take umbrage at negative press coverage and have been known to freeze some reporters out. I know it was a different era back then, but did the governor ever react to a story in such a way that he said, "I don't want to deal with this reporter anymore unless I have to"? And of course, you mentioned the reporter from the Times who was replaced. Anybody else who kind of, got him?
Sure, there were some that yes, there were some who had earned his enmity more than others. They were less responsible, and he had his favorites and his unfavorites, of course.
And how did he deal with them?
He did not seek them out. You can't bar them from a news conference, no.
So it basically he controlled the flow of information to reporters with whom he wanted to talk, and others who were not in his favor were ignored.
Well, they weren't ignored.
Well, didn't get the same kind.
Right. Sure. Right. Sure, he had less forthcoming.
Any other stories about the governor you remember?
Well, I remember lots, but I don't know how many are interesting.
Yeah, go ahead, give us a couple more. Where were you when he won re-election? Were you out? Were you back at the shop, getting ready for the election day edition, or the election morning edition, I should say?
Yeah, it was. Well, I went home for dinner. It was a deluge. You might not recall that. It was a tremendously rainy day, and the mighty Hohokus Brook had overflowed its banks, and my polling place was on the other side of the brook than the place where I was living. And when we moved back north, we rented a house first, and so I drove in to the polling place and voted, and then I couldn't get across the Hocus Brook in a car. You couldn't get, so I rolled up my pants legs and waded across to go home. Fortunately, we had another car, so I could get back to the newsroom later that night to look over the returns.
Well, you had been out of the administration, I think we said about 9 months. But I was going to say that in 77, I think you had said he had won by the largest number of votes in 73. That in 77 it was even larger, I believe, wasn't it?
I don't think so.
Oh, it wasn't.
It was large. It was very large.
Very large. What was your reaction back in the newsroom? I mean, you had 2 years with this guy, had gone through an awful lot of things with him. Feel happy for him? Feel gratified in some way?
Oh, sure, very gratified. But we weren't surprised. I mean, the outcome.
Well, when did it begin, in your mind, as a journalist, when did it begin to turn in Governor Burns' in favor? The campaign. Some people said it was with the release of this Bateman-Simon plan on the last Friday in September. This tax plan, I guess, for Senator Bateman.
Well, I think it really started to turn when Ray Bateman, of whom I'm very fond, always had a good friendly relationship with him, when Ray Bateman bought into and said that he could live without an income tax. And he knew that wasn't true, and he did it because the party, the big factors in the Republican Party insisted on it. The income tax was just this sore point, and Ray Bateman is too honest a man to lie effectively, and I say that as a compliment. Right. And I could tell, and not because of any magic understanding on my part, just because other people who paid attention realized that, and as the summer went on, they realized that. And then, of course, when came out with the Bateman-Simon plan, and the governor referred to it by its initials, that was icing on the cake.
Who was your successor as Director of Public Information?
Well, it was not easy to recruit one.
Find a...
My immediate successor was a man named Ben Borowski from Gloucester County, was it, or Burlington?
I remember the name. I'm not sure.
Yeah, but that didn't work out so well. And then he was moved over to another post. And then Joe Santangelo from the Record came in, and he served through most of the second term, and then he left to go into industry, and for the last 10 months it was John Farmer, who's now the national, not New Jersey, political writer, columnist for the Ledger.
And Joe Santangelo had been on the Trenton Bureau staff, right? He was a State House reporter, so he was even closer to the action when he was appointed than you were when you were appointed, because you were an editorial writer and a columnist, and you weren't in Trenton every day like Joe was.
That's right. Okay. He was the Trenton Bureau chief.
Okay. Looking at the second term, again, you're on the sidelines. If you can do it both ways, as a journalist, as a citizen/journalist, and as someone who had worked with the governor during his first term, some commentaries on what he was able to do and how he comported himself in the second term. What were his accomplishments? Were you as impressed? You said he should run for re-election because he did a lot of good things. Did that carry over into a second term, from what you remember?
Oh, sure. I think he continued to do good things. He had passed the first restrictions on campaign donations, not as effective as it should be, and still not today. But at least that was a beginning, and New Jersey was the first state to finance gubernatorial campaigns out of the public treasury. He created the public defender. Well, that was in the first term. The public defender. I meant to have that in my early lift. I think that was very important. Later abolished, and more recently reestablished. Spending caps on all levels of government. Of course, that was another to try and get the income tax passed to show that New Jersey was not spending a lot of money. In fact, in 1975, the New Jersey budget went down from 74. The 74 budget, largely he inherited from the previous administration. He could do some fine-tuning on it, but and we actually spent less as a state in 75 than in 74. That trend did not continue. But yes, and what else did I have on my list? Oh, the Port Authority. He got the Port Authority to abandon its restriction on giving any money to mass transit, hence PATH. But he didn't get the, but he got them to drop that restriction. All those big Wall Street guys. And, well, there are a lot of other things.
Do you have any stories about the renaming the Meadowlands Arena the Brendan Byrne Arena?
Well, I think that ranked just slightly behind the not in the foreseeable future quote. No, usually we name things after dead people. I'm sure there are other exceptions to the rule. But yes, in West Virginia there are a lot, I guess. But
right.
but usually you name things after dead people, and that was just not the thing to do.
Well, what's the story behind it?
What was the story behind it?
What was the story behind it? Who decided that it was going to happen?
Well, the Sports Authority, the members of the Sports Authority made the decision. It's their decision. They've been appointed by Governor Byrne. And
this was when? This was after you had left the governor's office, right?
Yep.
What kind of stand did the record take on the naming?
Oh, I don't know.
You don't remember?
I don't think it wasn't a big issue.
Oh, really? Even though it was in your bailiwick?
No, not a big issue. We may have made some snide comment on it. But it had these 5-foot letters right there on the turnpike and so on. And but Byrne loves sports and plays sports, and that's a very important part of his life. And he got that built, and that was an achievement.
Well, it also led to one of his, I don't know, one of his more famous one-liners, but to a one-liner. He said he never knew he was an Italian until he looked up and he saw his name, Brendan Byrne Arena.
Yeah, right. He also made one of his trips to Italy that were highly criticized by the press and all his critics, traveling so much out of state, out of the country, and he came back and told some gathering. He said, "Well, yeah, I was in Rome. They got that big Colosseum over there. I think I talked them into naming it after me." But they didn't. No, that was not a.
Anything, Don? Anything else?
You talk about sort of the ledger's influence on
Oh, yes.
Sunday story,
The ledger's influence on.
on setting policy about what Sunday news is.
Oh. You talk about during the time he was.
And we used to try to leak things to them to influence the Sunday story.
Oh, yeah. Well, they certainly, when the Ledger became the dominant newspaper in the state, why they had these guys who went out on law and the environment and what was the education. I think there was a fourth, but I've forgotten it.
Well, Herb Jaffe covered kind of a number of different areas.
Laws.
Institutions and agents, the jails, the prisons, and things like that.
Yeah. So, and these guys developed, they could write forever. The stories went on and on. I think it was the Washington Post. But they write these big, long stories, and they dug out stuff. And, of course, it was the dominant paper, and it got loads of leaks and developed some very good stories. I personally felt most of them could use an editor's touch, a little cutting here and there, but Mort Pye, let them go. And they had a tremendous influence.
Was there a little jealousy on your part, having come from the Record, that you kind of felt that, gee, we, the Record, should be doing more of what the Ledger is doing?
Certainly there was jealousy of the dominant paper in the state. The Record was second in the state, but it was only about a third of the circulation of the Ledger. So, sure, there was some jealousy.
Was it a matter of resources, primarily?
No, it was a matter of the Record is published up in one extreme corner of the state.
It's really a region. It's not a state paper. It's a local regional paper.
Well, the Record has for many years had a major influence way beyond its circulation because of the kind of journalism it does and because of the kind of stories it has developed. And it's highly regarded. Even Tom Kane, who was furious with the Record for many years, made sport of it at his when he got a chance at the legislative.
Made sport of it?
Oh yeah, I always had jokes about Record reporters and so on because they were highly critical. But some of the things, and Christy Whitman even more so. But yeah, but it has an influence. That's another thing. We worked out something when I was the editor. We worked out something so we got the Record delivered to the State House newsstand and the station, the railroad station in Trenton. Didn't sell very many copies, but they reached important eyes. And that was not easy to arrange, but we got them down there. So it would have more influence. But certainly nothing compared to the influence.
You were with the Record from '77 until '88, I believe, when you retired from the Record. Let's go back to television.
I didn't really retire. I was
I didn't
disappeared.
necessarily want to bring that up. You left. Let's talk about the evolution of television news coverage, and for good or ill, coverage of New Jersey news. The fact that some stations had bureaus in the state. Did you feel it added? Was it helpful to getting the word out to New Jersey citizens, the television helping that?
I'm not really qualified to talk about that, Roger, because I don't watch much local newscasts. I don't think I don't admire them greatly, what I see of them, and all the happy talk and the sports guy and the weather guy and all that stuff. And they have some important stories and they play a role, there's no question about it. And more people watch the local newscasts than watch the network newscasts, as you know, all across the country. Why do you think that is? I think it's because they have two things that the network news can't deliver.
Blood and guts.
Local sports.
And weather.
And weather. Local weather. So everyone can cover the tornadoes in Nebraska, but not.
I remember a former colleague of mine used to talk, if it bleeds, it leads.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And it so often bleeds. Yeah.
I have a question I want to ask just about journalism preparation. You go back to the 50s and followed from, let's for argument's sake say, what, 55, 59 when you started in Trenton. Formally, to 88. So that's 30 years. What about the preparation of journalists? How prepared to cover Trenton were the journalists who you had originally had contact with, and how did their development or lack of development occur over the years?
Well, you get very little preparation. As I said, Jim Sutphin, our editor at the Record, had been the political writer himself, and that was one of his great enthusiasms. And so he was a great help to me in getting a memory, historical memory, and so on things. And but you get thrown down there, you don't know much about what's going on, how the system works, and how it's going to change, and what should change, and so on. And that just comes with time.
So you're talking about longevity. When you returned as editor for the final 11 years at the Record, did you try to keep, as much as you could, the Record Trenton Bureau staff intact because of the importance of that institutional memory?
Sure.
How successful were you? And how successful were papers like the Ledger, for that matter, as far as you know?
I don't think there's a great turnover in the Trenton staffs. There's some, of course, but I don't think there's a turnover is a major problem. No, people enjoy that beat and believe, rightly so, that they're doing important work.
Ron? That's great. Thank you, sir. Anything else you want to say?
Just in final,
Yeah, go ahead.
We talked about Brendan Byrne and his personality and how uncomfortable he is with many politicians and so on. When I went in and told him that I was going back to the Record and going to leave him, and I was sorry to leave him at that time, and he paid me what I've always considered to be a major compliment. He said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I've become comfortable with you." And that, I think, is a high compliment from him. Thanks, Roger.
Thank you.